Bueno,
Well, hello. Good afternoon, good evening. Well, first of all, thank you to Fundación Telefónica for holding this event in such a great space. We feel like family here. And in order to introduce Douglas Stewart and Shaggy Bain, as you know, well, Douglas has been awarded with the Booker Prize in 2020, and we have the great privilege of having him with us today. I would like to say thank you for accepting this invitation to Spain, well, to come to Spain. We know that he has a great tour all around Europe, and he has been very kind, and he has come here to go through this some kind of daily torture in terms of press and events. And thanks to Maria Jesus, who will hold the dialogue with Douglas about the novel. Thank you, Maria Jesus, for accepting this invitation. And I would like to say just a few things from the Sexto Piso publishing house. We published the book as Historia de Shaggy Bain. This is some kind of great milestone. It's not only the book that you want to have in your catalog, but also it's a book that sets the catalog. I mean, it's a milestone for the catalog itself. So the fact of having such a book is to have some very important chapters for the publishing house. So we are very, very happy and thankful because, well, Douglas trusted us to publish the book. So I give the floor to Maria Jose and Douglas so that you can get started.
Sí.
una última cosa.
Just one last thing. Sorry, I had forgotten that. We will be signing books when the event is over. He will be signing the book for all the attendants. If you are on streaming, he will be at the book fair in Madrid in stand 35. If you want to be there with the author tomorrow. And that's it. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Douglas, for being here with us today. We're going to try and talk about the novel, obviously without giving any spoilers, obviously because the goal is to sell books, not to prevent us from selling them. So at the same time, I do have the challenge of trying not to repeat any of the questions that you have already been asked in the 300 interviews that you have attended around Spain and in Europe. I think that's a very difficult challenge, but I will try to be up to the task. For those of you who might not know the author beforehand, and although I'm sure you do because his novel is a great success around the world, and Douglas is the author of Shaggy Bain. It's a novel that is absolutely wonderful. It's tender, it's moving. I was telling the publishers before that it had been a while since I had last cried so much while reading a book, but also it's full of light. It's a bright novel, and it's something that I would like to talk about in the interview today. And it's also very tender. It's so tender that is also within your literary style. And it's a book that was rejected before it was published and before it was awarded the prestigious Man Booker. And it was rejected up to 44 times before it was finally published. And I think it's a great model. And it is even like a thread of the novel. And it's one of the topics of the novel. And this is where I would like to start, talking about resilience. You talk a lot about this, the odyssey that the novel has gone through after being rejected 43 times denotes a very resilient attitude, but also the characters in your novel are very resilient. So what's your relationship with this concept, and would you say you're a resilient person?
That's a great question to begin with. Thank you, and a hard one. Thank you very much for having me in Madrid. It is my pleasure and my honor to be here, especially after the year we've all had. It's great to see you. Resilience, I think, is something that you can't always name, or you can't always say that it's a quality you have. You almost just have to persevere. And certainly in terms of Shuggie Bain, I think Shuggie, the character at the heart of it, or one of the characters at the heart of it, it's almost his superpower as a child. He doesn't understand that the world should be different. He doesn't understand that his mother, he understands that he'd like to see her well, but he doesn't know anything else about the world. And so he comes at everything with this almost radical acceptance sometimes, and he just keeps moving forward. He is really the symbol of hope in the book for me, and he's the reason why I called the book Shuggie Bain and not Agnes Bain, because and we'll probably talk about it later, about my own love and loss and grief, but I knew that perhaps Agnes wouldn't transcend the situation she was in, but it's a universal truth that parents always hope for better for their children, I think. And so Shuggie is really the little splinter of hope that comes off of Agnes. But hope can be a very tender thing. It can be a very quiet thing. It can be quite delicate as well. And so Shuggie's hope is just the fact that he gets up every single day and comes back to the situation and returns to it without judgment, which is really important. He returns to it only with love, and he really wants the best, both for his mother and for everyone else whom he loves. But rejection, to talk about myself after that, rejection is part of a writer's life. I think you have to be comfortable around rejection if you're ever going to be a writer. And even after winning the Booker, after writing some short stories that have been in the New Yorker, I'm still rejected. There are critics, there are readers, there are publishers that don't feel a connection with my work, and that is okay. But through the 44 rejections, actually, it was 44, but I only learned that after I won the Booker, because my agent told me it was 20, because she saw how demotivated I was and how crushed I was by that. But it was 44 rejections. But through that, I didn't change a word of the book, because I understood that I'd created the piece of art that I had wanted, and I was very certain of it. And so I just kept my head down, and I knew the book, Shuggie Bain, had a heart, and I was sure someone would discover that heart eventually.
Me sorprende mucho.
I'm very surprised by this certainty that you display. Given the fact that it's your first novel, this is something uncommon. You might think that with the first novel, the author feels insecure about certain decisions, and I believe that any creative act, the seed of any creative act, is a mystery, and I think this is a beautiful part of art. I think you were 10 years writing, it took you 10 years to write this book, and you have explained that this came from this need of yours, that it came out of, it stemmed out of your heart. But I would like to know, where do you get this certainty from? And also you have mentioned that this is not a novel that could have been born or could have been created in any writing school, although there might be excellent writing schools. But what was your relationship with literature as a reader, but also with regards to the techniques related to writing? Have you self-taught yourself, or did you just sit down and it started coming out in a stream?
Yeah. Well, first of all, just to talk a little bit more about rejection, I mean, I'm not sure. I think rejection is something I've been comfortable with my entire life. First of all, I was rejected by my father. My father left when I was 4 years old. He never once looked back. And then I was rejected by all the men in the community around me because I was different. I was far too young to have any sexual desire or any gender identity, but I was rejected just because I didn't fit in. I didn't like the things that the other boys liked. And so rejection was just a theme of my childhood. And so when you face that at a very young age, you realize that, well, actually you didn't realize at the time, but I was forever trying to change myself to get around that rejection. And then I just gave up. I decided, when you're about a teenager, you know exactly what you're about, and you just have to continue, and people will reject you or they won't. So it wasn't that I was especially zen with my rejection around the book. It was just that I was comfortable in that space. But the book took me 10 years to write, and it is true that I wrote it in total isolation. The only person I told who I was writing the book was actually my husband, because first of all, I'm the product of a very classist society. I grew up in poverty in Glasgow. I would say I probably came from a place where not very much in terms of academia was expected of young men at the time. And so to study English, to study academia, to study literature was not really something that the community around me saw for me. And then also my education was entirely disrupted, both because of the bullying I experienced and also because of my own mother's addiction. I missed many, many weeks, months of school. But we also didn't grow up in a house with books, and that wasn't because we weren't curious or empathetic or, children that were creative. It was just because literature generally didn't talk to our community. We never found ourselves in literature, and literature was something that happened in London, happened to the middle class. And so I don't really read a book until I'm about 17 or 18. Anybody needs an awful lot of peace in their life to be able to read a book. You first of all need peace inside yourself. You also need peace in your environment. Books are quite hard things to really sink into, and unless you have that, you can't quite concentrate. And so when I discover literature as a young man, I discover it at maybe 18, 19, and then I start to devour it. But it's only really when I'm in my 20s that I discover literature that reflects a facet of myself, whether that's queer literature or literature of the working class or even just regional voices, thinking of Scotland in that way. So really, when I'm 32, I sit down to write Shuggie Bain with all this in mind and all of these feelings as part of my life. And I was worried that my friends would say to me, because I don't have an MFA, I didn't have a circle of writer friends, I was worried that they would say to me, who do you think you are? Why would you be writing a book? And so for the first few drafts, I wouldn't even admit that was what I was trying to achieve to myself, because it was just far too intimidating, and it really made me feel incredibly, it was just too big of a thing to dream of. And so I just sat down and I wrote a sentence, and then I wrote a paragraph, and then I actually wrote the chapter that is at the heart of the book now, where the two brothers go scrapping for copper wire on the surface of the coal mine. And then from there, the stories really just flowed out. I have to fix this zipper because it keeps catching on my...
Sí, nada. Aprovecho para
I take the opportunity. You've mentioned this before, I believe. As you said before, this is why it's called the Shuggie Bain. The book is called Shuggie Bain and not Agnes Bain, because there is a viewpoint, the child's viewpoint and his understanding of the story. And in a way, we cannot disconnect our childhood from the socio-economical context in which we live, because obviously it talks to us and it affects us. And I think this is very well explained in the book. And I don't know if you were looking for one of the aspects of it that relates to the social and historic times. You talk a lot about Glasgow as a place that is particularly moved, where many intense things happen. What was it like, Glasgow in the 80s, that we know the figure of Margaret Thatcher? And you talk about the mining issues and the taxi drivers as well, and we will talk about them later on. How would you say Glasgow was back then, and would you say Shuggie's and Agnes's life would have been the same if they had been born elsewhere in the United Kingdom?
I think it's hard to say if they would be the same if they'd been born elsewhere, but Glasgow is certainly a character in the book, and she is, I think of her as a her, she's really sort of going through very similar things to the main character that Agnes is going through. But Glasgow's an incredibly diverse city. It has extreme wealth. It has some of the oldest universities in the United Kingdom. It has families who are prospering and who have prospered all throughout history. But it is formed by the working class. I think of it as a overwhelmingly working class city. And that was a great thing, because it actually brought in an awful lot of Irish immigration at the beginning beginning of the 20th century, when shipbuilding, when coal, when steel were booming. But by the 1950s, Glasgow goes through a huge urban reorganisation where I think they say there was over 1.5 million people living in 2 square miles. And it was incredibly unhealthy. Sometimes there wasn't indoor toilets. Sometimes there was too many families living in a tenement building. And so they tore down a lot of that city and they built very new housing estates. These housing estates seemed really futuristic at the time, but we know now in hindsight that they became housing projects, and we know that there was no amenities, we know there was a lack of a sense of community, and when unemployment starts to rise, people started to lose hope. So that's part of the backdrop of the actual physical city. In the 1980s, Glasgow had always been a place of solidarity, of compassion, of neighbours looking after each other, of artistic creativity, and people who speak very plainly and very bluntly. They never sugarcoat what they're going to tell you, even if they adore you. And even the language in itself has violence and tenderness quite close together. You can say something that sounds incredibly aggressive to somebody, but it's actually a real sentence or an affirmation of affection. But in the 1970s, 1980s, the United Kingdom starts to deindustrialise. But Glasgow is severely impacted by this because unemployment goes to about 26%, and it stays there for most of my youth, or so most of Shuggy's youth. There's actually something called the Glasgow effect, which is, it's really an intangible thing, but it's when hope leaves a community. It actually took 11 years off the life expectancy of working class men, which is an enormous thing to rob from any human life. But that was the effect of the government and the government policies. And I think we felt incredibly overlooked by the government that was 500 miles away down in London. And they certainly knew what was happening in the city, and they didn't rush to bring us new jobs or new opportunities or new solutions for housing. And so that's really the context for the backdrop for where the Bains are. I think there were many cities that went through this similar decline, but I think what's specific about Glasgow is the compassion. And as you had said earlier, it's about the darkness and the light together.
Hemos hablado.
We've talked about resilience before, but I think that other topic within the novel is the caring in your book and also in our country, and we've seen this during the pandemic. Caring is a job that is carried out by women. It's something that is mainly related to the female world, and that has been assigned to women. It has been forced upon women. Not always women wanted to take care of others, and many often wanted to be cared for instead. And we will talk about women in a moment, but I would like to deal with the male characters. And since you were talking about the disindustrialization process, these are wounded men in your novel. At the beginning, you approach the plot and you just read the back cover. You read about a woman who has a womanizer, a taxi driver as a husband, who leaves her for another woman, and he leaves her with 3 children, and you obviously take sides with her. But there are many male characters within the novel that are particularly wounded and hurt, and I think that has to do with the loss of their jobs, and I think this is very much connected with these mining ambience and environment, with what mining represents for them. And when they lose their jobs, they collapse and they lose their way. I'm not justifying them, but they're, at the end of the day, they're hurt characters in your novel.
Yeah, I'm so glad actually you said wounded and hurt, because in part of writing the book, in some of the first drafts, I wanted to find blame. I wanted to find who was responsible for it. And the more time I spent with the men, I had to think, actually, they're incredibly hurt also. And so you couldn't originate it there. But, Deborah Orr wrote a really fantastic memoir called Motherwell. And in it, she writes about her own father, and she writes about her father working at Ravenscraig Steel. And we'll talk about this a bit more, but her father goes to work and one day he's almost killed by a steel girder. And he's terrified by that, as any sane person would be. But he has nowhere to talk about his fear or his hurt, or that's scary because men aren't allowed to talk about that. So he becomes incredibly silent and he becomes really stoic, and he just carries all that inside of himself. And when I was writing the book, I was thinking about, before you get to the Thatcher years, we were asking our fathers and our brothers to go a mile under the ground and to get coal. They would come back to the earth and they wouldn't be paid very much for it. But we never said to them, are you okay? Are you afraid? Do you have other dreams? Do you want to be a poet? We just expected them to do it because they had to provide for the families. And so there's an awful lot of hurt there. There's so much things that go unexpressed in terms of vulnerability for a start. But Shuggie Bain stands in quite a long literary tradition. There are lots of books writing about industrial Britain, or deindustrializing Britain, or the working class, the poor suffering soul. There's certainly cinema if you think about Ken Loach as well. But what I actually wanted to do was to push the men against the landscape as much as I could. You couldn't do it all the way because society is still formed around men at that time. I mean, the central thing in a household is the job that the father does or that the man does. If it's a country that socializes around football, that's an incredibly masculine thing. Even for the character of Agnes, socializing as well is about pubs and about drinking together. But then women weren't allowed into pubs freely. If they had to go in, they had to go in with a man. They would have to sit in a snug. And even if a woman later years would go into a pub, it would probably be something that she would be judged quite harshly for. So you have labor, you have politics, you also have social issues that all revolve around men. But because I was the son of a single mother and because I was queer, I knew that the strength of the city and that the real story of the city was with the women. It was with my grandmother, my mothers, my sisters, and I wanted to show their resilience, how they were coping as the men were struggling.
I would like to read a small fragment that I think is a very good example of this type of man and the work that Douglas does when writing this. Please forgive the translation. In Pighead, everyone knew the story of Ian Lambert, the miner, whose wife left him right before the mine blew up. Without a wife to sustain, he kept all the money of the damages under his bed, while the rest of the miners had spent all their money in alcohol or their clothes for their increasing number of sons and daughters. He had a little money left, and he also got a part-time job repairing TVs. Women talked about him as if he was a loner who was not made for the relationships, and he still looked like a child who had been malnourished. And these women brought him dishes with overcooked potatoes and frozen broth. They said he was a good man, although very idiosyncratic, and that he managed to find a job after the mine closed down. Ladies fed him with the remains of their own food, and knowing that the damages that he received after the closing up of the mine could have fed their children for over a year or even more. I think this fragment is particularly interesting to talk about these men, and I wonder too how you could come up with the part of the book where you build the identity, Shaggie's identity, because I think it's very interesting that having all these references of the men who worked in the mines, who were rough and who had been hurt, who were dark, sometimes literally when they came back from the mines, how could Shaggie create this identity for himself with all his role models from the men's side were completely different, when his own mother had a lot of issues to deal with, and when he was a lonely boy. When I read the novel, I kept remembering that sentence from Rilke where he says that childhood is the true home of the human being that always goes with you. You're always a child that you once were. How do you build this identity? I understand through suffering, but also with a certain satisfaction also.
Yeah. Before we talk about the identity of him, I was thinking about the passage that you just read about, hopefully we all are in love for love and we marry because we want to be with that person. But sometimes in some societies, there's a necessity to it. There's a need for survival in staying with the person you love. And in fact, that was one of those really pivotal moments that Thatcher indirectly brought about, where women had to reimagine, why were they even here? Why were they with the man that they were with? Did they love him, or was it because society needed them to have a man at home? Yeah, I mean, I think that's the central question for Shuggie in the book, because he's not actually even that special or that unusual as a child. He's just, he's a very effeminate young boy, but he's also infected in many ways by his mother's sense of manners, by her pride, by her, it's almost snobbishness a little bit with Agnes. And the other rough and tumble boys around him just don't quite know how he fits in. And so I wanted the homophobia to be very direct and very low frequency like that. I didn't want to wrap it up in religious ideals or in sex. It was just really about, it's what are you? What are you doing here, sort of thing. And for me, that was exactly what it was. It was, in a lot of ways, it was a cousin of misogyny. It was about, why are you feminine? Why are you effeminate? And that was as complicated as the argument got in people's minds. And I think it was because, men were really trying to hold themselves together and not express themselves. Self-expression was quite a dangerous thing. I think a lot about the fact that, men of my father's generation had no female friends that were just platonic. They couldn't just hang around with a woman. There was always had to be a romantic or sexual relationship or a family relationship. There was no just friendships. And that's a really strange society to be in. And so here's Shuggie, that's just this ball of energy, ball of light. He likes playing with hair. He likes to style hair. He likes to play with dolls, with little plastic ponies. And the boys see him from miles away and just know he doesn't belong here. But part of the conversation in the book is, where do you belong if the place you are you can't escape? And Shuggie and Agnes have that in common.
You talk about Agnes and Shuggie, and I think that the core of, or the spine of the book is the beautiful and fierce relationship that they two have with each other, and how at a certain point the roles are shifted, and the son imposes himself the challenge of saving his mother, a mother who falls into alcohol. And this situation, this fact also generates different situations, her addiction to alcohol. And at some point, Shuggie tells her that he's going to do whatever it takes to save her. He would even be ready to destroy himself in order to save her. There's a breaking point in the novel, I don't want to give a spoiler, where this is sorted out, but it's very strange, this swapping of roles.
Yeah. The first thing I think to say is, if the book had been a middle-class narrative, it would be very possible that the Bain family were the only family on the street having a tough time and everyone else would be fine. But as we know, when unemployment becomes that high, then hope can leave a community, and the East End of Glasgow had a problem with drink and drugs. And so what I wanted to keep showing is that Shuggie, I keep trying to zoom out in the book and showing other children who are living similar lives. That's really important for me. I don't want anyone to ever think it's just Shuggie and Agnes that are going through this. But yeah, Agnes and Shuggie are fictional characters, but I drew on my own experience with my own mother, where our relationship was entirely reversed sometimes, where she could not be my mother, and instead I would be her caregiver, I would be her best friend, I would be her confidant. In fact, as a child, it's a very strange lesson to learn, but because I was born into my own mother's identity, my own mother's alcoholism, I never knew that I was the most important person in the room, which most children, I think, are allowed to believe. suddenly you're aware that this person over here needs something from you all the time. And so you have to use this incredible intuition and watchfulness, and it makes you change yourself on all kinds of levels. You try to be neater and smarter and quieter and better at school. You try to keep your room clean, whatever you think it is that might be causing this adult's addiction, when of course it's none of that, right? It's absolutely none of that. But as a child, you take all this on yourself. And in fact, you know, the genesis for writing the book really starts when I'm about 7 or 8. So when someone suffers with addiction, men, we forgive them. It happens in public. We kind of think it's a facet of their nature. If they drink too much, if they fight too much, if they become difficult. When women do it, it happens in private, and society turns away from them, especially very devout Catholic societies. Already, when you're a single mother, that's almost too much to bear. But when you also carry an awful lot of hurt, people don't like to look at you a lot. And so my own mother was incredibly isolated. And so she treated me almost like a confidant. And something we started to do when I was 7 or 8 is I realized if I just listened to her and just gave her someone to talk to, then she wouldn't get too bad with alcohol and she wouldn't hurt herself. And so I would sit at her feet with a school book and I would write her memoir. And this was great for her because she wanted to be heard. She was so unheard in the community. And it wasn't that she didn't have a loud voice, because the women were very forceful. It was just that nobody was listening. And so I would just sit at her feet and she would tell me things, and it was never a once upon a time. It was always the most heartbreaking or the saddest, or things that a mother should never really tell a child. But it gave her an enormous amount of ease. And the funny thing about it is the reason why Elizabeth Taylor becomes a motif in the book is because my mother always started her memoirs with, "To Elizabeth Taylor, who knows nothing about love." And for me, this was like a really forceful thing for a working class woman to want to say, that she's going to tell this Hollywood icon. But of course, Elizabeth Taylor as an actress, as a person, was difficult. She was damaged. She never played a very meek, quiet character. She was unlucky in love. She had her own problems with alcoholism, and we celebrated it for her. But when you're a real woman and you have those same things, then you get vilified for it. And so I think my mother always felt some sense of injustice.
Desde luego.
From the book, you can understand, and I don't know if this has to do with your own experience, we get the impression that Shaggy will never get to know anybody as important in his life as his mother. There's a certain fascination also. And sometimes it's difficult to understand where it comes from since he's so young. It's difficult to understand how he can want to save her so badly and how he understands everything so well, even sometimes better than she does herself. You have talked about her drinking problem, and there's a point in the book where when you say that Agnes had not been the same since New Year's Eve. Someone had left her naked under a lot of coats, and after that she lost her wish for having fun. And when Shaggy saw her drinking, he realized that she wasn't trying to have fun. It was the only way to step away from the pain and the loneliness. I believe that it's very interesting in your novel the way you present this single mother with a drinking problem. As you have said, she tries to be saved from pain and from loneliness in alcohol, but at the same time you describe her in such a way that you might think that she never loses her charisma, her kindness. And sometimes this illness, as I see alcoholism, sometimes really darkens the identity of the person who endures this. And I would like to know how you'd worked on this relationship with alcohol.
Yeah. I was fortunate, and maybe fortunate isn't the right word, to say that actually I was surrounded by many people who were suffering with addiction as a child. There is a really strong community in Alcoholics Anonymous that really does look after each other and takes care of each other. And so a lot of my childhood was involved with that, I guess, that culture. But before Agnes is a mother who descends into alcoholism, I wanted her to be a really complex woman. You know, I wanted her to be fantastic. I wanted her to be glamorous, defiant, trouble. She's all of these things, but she's also a person in her individual self. And what I wanted, sometimes when we write about alcoholism in literature, that becomes almost someone's personality. It almost becomes what they do and who we think of them as the character. And actually, that is never it for Agnes. Agnes is still all those things. She's still a wounded wife. She's still looking for love. I hope she's just these very complicated things. But part of the thing you have to get right as well about alcoholism is that it's very mutable, it's very changeable. And part of the terror that Shuggie faces in the book is not, you know, will Agnes have a drink today? Will she not have a drink? But if she drinks, what kind of person is she going to become? Sometimes Agnes drinks and she has a wonderful time, and it's really a great time. She does it to bring out joy or fun in herself. Other times it's for sadness. Often she drinks to bring out anger, because women had no other way to express their frustration or their anger, at least the women I knew, because you couldn't go out in the street and tell someone that you were angry with them, because it might have physical consequences for you. And so instead, the alcohol would provide her that sort of catalyst. And she spends a lot of time in the book at the telephone, and she gets drunk and she calls people from her past. And she says, I remember you from 1977. And, you know, and now we're in 1988. So she's really digging into her memory. But there's an anxiety there for Shuggie and for Leek. And he spends actually a lot of time in the book standing outside of the family house and just sort of looking at the windows. And he tries to discern, you know, are the lamps on, but are the curtains open? Can he hear some music? If he can hear some music, is it country and western music, which would be about sadness, or is it pop music? You know, what really would that be? And that is, that sort of anxiety is something he goes through, but I also wanted the reader to feel it.
We've talked before, and I have one last question, and then we will open the mic so that you can consider if you want to ask any questions to Douglas. We've talked about the homophobia, and it's particularly important to talk about this topic that I'm sure you've been asked about this earlier, but it's very discouraging and sad. And I think that we need to reflect on this as a society. How can we be reading this book that is that takes place in the 80s with this homophobia and the bullying because of a child being effeminate, and we're in 2021, 40 years after, and at least in our country, and in particular in Madrid, we are going through a phase that is disconcerting many of us, because we thought that we had conquered many rights and many freedoms, and we weren't paying attention to them because it was so natural to us all. And all of a sudden, we are brought back in time very quickly. We didn't expect this to happen. And I wanted to ask you, why would you say is the reason that this is happening, and what we should do in order to revert the situation? I think there's a clear educational aspect to it, but how can we be alert and pay attention so that this doesn't happen anymore?
That's a wonderful question. You know, Funnily enough, when I wrote Shuggie Bain, I was writing very simply a love story. It's a love story between a mother and son. It's a woman's quest for love, or to recover from spurned love, and also a young boy's quest for self-love. But it became an incredibly political book, and then I thought to myself, okay, but it's politics that belong in 1980s Glasgow, such a specific time and place. And then the book publishes, and certainly in the UK, all of these things, the poverty, the abandonment, the homophobia are still going on, the lack of opportunities for working class communities. You know, there's a lot of the book is about divisiveness. The thing you have to understand about the characters in the book is socioeconomically and culturally, they're identical. You know, everyone's bringing in the same amount of money to the house, or they're not. They all live in the same house because they're council houses. So there's an awful lot of solidarity and collectivism there. But sometimes solidarity can be used to exclude you if you don't fit in or if you don't conform to that. And what I also wanted to say is, when things are hard in general for society, when people feel times are tough, that's when hate and divisiveness really comes out. And I think that's probably what we're seeing in the United Kingdom and the United States and Spain at the moment with the return of homophobia. I think things are generally very hard for a lot of people. And so they are looking for people to oppress with that. That's why you see it come back. And that's much of what the book is about. There's people who are trying to, you know, who are just need somebody to look down upon and to punch down upon. And that's something we always have to be vigilant against.
And we need to be resilient as well, because sometimes it's hard to do, but it's something, I think it's one of the lessons to be learned from your book. I don't know if someone might want to ask a question to Douglas. Please go ahead.
No se quite la mascarilla, con la mascarilla puesta.
Sí, perdón, que tengo que...
Forgive me, I need to speak Spanish, but I think you will understand me perfectly well. This topic of homophobia or the phobia against the poor or those who lack opportunities, how can we face this? Because I know before Margaret Thatcher, United Kingdom was more had more opportunities for people. There was better protection, and then the trend started to be to promote inequalities, to have people have more wealth than others. And what would you think about in what way can we fight both in Europe and in the United States to have equal opportunities? How can we promote the acceptance of the differences and love between human beings? How would you propose we do this?
Well, thank you for your excellent question. I hope I can do it justice. I'm not a politician, and so I'll do my very best. I think a lot about the fabric of society and how strong the fabric of society was when Shuggie is set. And although times are tough for the characters in the novel, there was an awful lot of solidarity, but the government caught people at the very bottom and wouldn't allow them to fall too far. There was an understanding that many people were in it together, and together they were powerful. I think we have come into a place now of the individual where we all think of ourselves as individual. And funnily enough, for all the connectivity we have as people in the world today, I think we're actually slightly more isolated because we are perhaps not feeling it in terms of community that's real and tangible, and that also can wield an awful lot of power. And so we think we're doing a lot of things through social media, but I think at the base root, people who are suffering in poverty now are no longer, for instance, in the United Kingdom, no longer have the government take care of their most basic needs and are turned towards charities or towards food banks or towards other places when really society should help them. You know, I mean, the big thing, I think, is we have to tax the rich, not only fairly, but actually beyond fairly, because I think they are being able to take the best out of society and not return anything to it. And I actually think, even in writing Shuggie Bain, that economics can be at the heart of a lot of problems that we think are other things. I think most people want a decent life. They want a good life for their children. They want, even if they're working hard work and they're not making too much, they want the belief that tomorrow will be better. And I think we are reaching the point where we believe tomorrow will be better just for some and not for everyone. And I think that's a dangerous place that we're at the moment.
Sí, ahí hay otro.
Okay, thank you very much. Please allow me to make the question, to try to put the question in English. Obviously, I am not, English is not my mother tongue, so I most probably make some mistakes, and I appreciate your effort to understand me. You spoke about socializing in the British society, in the United Kingdom society, that pubs and drinking and all this culture is a way of socializing for society, but also football. That means that football is very important. I at least it is what I understand. And being you from Glasgow and being you on this Scottish town, I will ask to you is if this football is also a way of promoting from one side homophobia and from the other side alcoholism. That means that is, at least from the supporters, there is quite common to go to matches and to drink normally more than it should be, no? And just the last question is a joke. You are a supporter of Rangers or Celtics?
Neither.
Ah, okay. You don't like the football then?
No, I don't like football.
Okay.
But I write about this in the book, and so I think your question's a really good one.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah, but let me just then finish. But because I understand that Celtics and Rangers are connected with both parts of society. That means Rangers are the Protestants and Celtics are Catholics, but not also that. That means Celtics are poor and Rangers are the rich part of the society. If this is true or not?
I think there's a lot of prejudice in that, and there's a lot of propaganda that might not be real. I think in general the Catholic community in Glasgow is a little bit more impoverished than the Protestant community, or certainly they were seen to be slightly more for the community and the working class, and a little bit less for the individual or individual advance. And I say that as someone who is both Protestant and Catholic. My father was Protestant, my mother was Catholic. But football is one of the things that defines Glasgow, and it's one of the things that sets the tone for the city. As I spoke about, men control work, they control how we socialise around pubs, but they also control recreation, and football is the lifeblood of the city. What I tried to show in the book is also how the sectarianism filters into that. So football brings many people lots of enjoyment. I don't particularly enjoy football, so don't listen to me about that. But for me as a kid, it was also about tribalism, and it was about, are you Catholic or are you Protestant, and what part of town did you find yourself in, and who do you support? And so for me, I also always connected it with a form of recreational violence, shall we say, or who are you sort of cheering for? And it always made me incredibly wary of it. But certainly that was the truth before I was a young boy, before I was born, and when I was a young boy. I think, I don't know the exact year, but I remember that, for instance, Rangers signed their first Catholic player in the 90s, and there was such taboo there that they wouldn't even hire a Catholic player. And I know that now has for the most part gone away.
Buenas tardes.
Good evening. Well, first of all, congratulations on your book. I haven't read it in full yet, but I think that it's a real moving story. I would like to speak about what the previous question was about. When I started to read the book, I find a reality that I didn't know. I've never been to Glasgow. I've been to Edinburgh, for example, but I didn't know that reality of that sectarism, that division between Catholics and Protestants. It reminded me, it recalled me Belfast in some case, with due distance, of course. But I would like to ask you if that division in society, so besides the axis, well, class, race, etc., we could add religion, for example, that has to do with identity. If, for example, in moments of tough crisis with important unemployment rates, maybe this dynamic could reinforce this division, or maybe there are times when people are able to be together. What has been the situation in Glasgow during the 80s? Or if you think that like homophobia or some discriminations are still being a problem, what would you say?
Yeah, I think the first thing about homophobia is the world was homophobic. I wouldn't, we use specifics in literature. Every book has to be set somewhere. Shuggie cannot have his feet in two continents, you wouldn't believe the book. So we use specifics to talk about universal human truths and to illuminate that. And I think certainly women feeling abandoned and overlooked is Agnes's truth, and Shuggie's otherness is a universal truth. I can't imagine it was much better in Spain in the 80s. And even the characters in the book who love Shuggie, like I said, still try to get him to change because they know the world he's coming into will be really hard on him. They don't want him to change because they don't love him. They want him to change so he'll be safe. But sectarianism's an interesting thing in Glasgow. And actually my next novel, which publishes in English next April, deals squarely with that. It deals about how we demonize young working class men. I spoke earlier about where does hurt start and where is the problem really. And I actually think we do a lot of damage to young working class men. So it's about two young men who have very low expectations from the community around them, and they're divided by sectarian lines. One is Protestant, one is Catholic, and yet they fall in love with each other. So it's a little bit of a northern Romeo and Juliet, you could say, but it's about where do you belong and how do tender souls survive in hard places. But sectarianism, you will know about Glasgow that it has the second largest Orange Pride walk, the Protestant Pride, after Belfast. But Glasgow doesn't have any of the extreme violence that Belfast has, which actually makes it more infuriating, right? Because in a way, the Irish problem is a really big question about identity. Are you Protestant Catholic? How about your faith? But also, who do you identify with? Are you Irish or are you British? Who owns this country in a lot of ways. And in Glasgow, it does come down a lot to recreational violence between young men. It comes down to drinking too much on football days, comes down to boys on housing estates, wanting to fight other boys on housing estates for something to do. Every city has gangs. But the thing about Glasgow that's extraordinary is it's a really diverse city, like every city. And I spoke about the wealth and the ancient seats of learning. The universities are world class. And yet, as a young man growing up in poverty, I didn't see that side of the city till I was about 18. Like it's only 3 miles away. I don't know how Madrid is set out, but I never got from the housing scheme I lived in and went and saw how other people lived until I was an adult.
Just another short question. You support independence of Scotland. What do you think about this?
Actually, I'm going to really disappoint you with my answer. I'm a Scotsman and I live in New York, and so out of respect for my family and everyone there, I never answer that question. I think you can probably imagine from the book, but I never answer. Thank you.
Hola. Por aquí hay otra.
There's another question.
Away from Scotland for a long time. Why do you feel the need to go back to Scotland to tell your stories? Why are you not telling stories? It's one of the best books I've ever read. It's not a problem. Yeah. But why do you feel like you need to go back to Scotland to tell your stories? What's so strong about your Scotland background that makes you feel like that's where your stories come from?
Yeah, I think one of the very first things was gave me an enormous amount of clarity. I think as a Scotsman you will understand how hard it is sometimes to talk about the community you're in while you're in it. And so the distance gave me an ability to look back with a sense of perspective. But actually, I was incredibly homesick, which I think is a hard thing sometimes for people to understand when they know that the book is not always necessarily says nice things about the time or the place. But I was incredibly homesick living in New York, and I wanted to be in Glasgow. I wanted to be back in the 80s in Glasgow, believe it or not, because it's the time, it's fundamentally who I am, and it is what formed me. And you know, I've always loved Glasgow. I'm not sure Glasgow loved me, to be really honest about it. They didn't love me as a young man, but it was never a conscious thought that I was going to write this big book about Glasgow, because actually the book is about Agnes for me. It's just I couldn't write about Agnes without it being about the place. Hopefully that's it.
Hola, yo no he leído el libro, pero tengo muchas ganas de leerlo y
I haven't read the book yet, but I'm really looking forward to it. And since you mentioned that you're going to publish a new book in April, how do you step out of that book and leave it behind in order to write something new and different, I suppose? So I imagine this is very heavy on you. So what is that process of leaving that behind to write something new like?
Thank you. Yeah, part of the reason why actually Shuggie needed to be published was because I couldn't get out from underneath Shuggie and Agnes. After 10 years, I was enjoying it for most of the time, but then unless I shared it with somebody, then I couldn't move beyond their story. But actually, Shuggie Bain, when you read the book, you'll realize we leave him on the brink of manhood, and I didn't want him to have a sexual desire or a romantic desire, because his big love in his life is his mother. But just the fact of writing Shuggie Bain made the next book, what the next book was going to be about, incredibly clear for me. I think of them almost as a diptych. Perhaps they'll end up being not a trilogy per se, but sort of a tapestry of all these lives that are living very parallel experiences. One of the things about Shuggie Bain is there's many voices in it. We hear from many people going through the same time. But Shuggie, almost needing to finish it, pushed me into the next book, because he asked me a question as well. When you read the book, there's a scene in the middle of it where Agnes makes a terrible deal with the man who lives across the street in order to take Shuggie, her young queer son, away for the weekend to teach him hunting and fishing and other things to make a man out of him. And I couldn't answer, I wanted to know more about that, but I couldn't answer it with this book because it took the focus away from them. And so really the story of Mungo and James, which is called Young Mungo, the next book, is really answering sort of how do men man up when that's not who they're going to be. I should also say it's a really funny book. We've probably spoken about really hard things, but there's a lot of love and a lot of humor in it.
Bueno, no sé si...
I don't know if there's any question left. I just have two more things to mention. First, we've talked about this before, and I'm asking this because it's already been published. The novel will be taken to the movies, and it seems like a very well-known director, movie maker, and
no sé hasta qué punto...
Stephen Daldry. And I suppose you're happy, but how involved are you in adapting your novel to the movies? Did you ever think about this being brought to the movie theaters? I think it's a very visual novel, and there are extraordinary characters to be brought to the cinema, but did you ever envision this?
You know, I am a very visual thinker, and as I write, I think in pictures, and actually the blockage for me often is translating the picture to words, because I see the images first and foremost. I think I had signed on to write all the series. Shuggie Bain is going to, we hope, you always have to say hope when you're dealing with television, I think. But we hope it's going to be a limited run series of 8 episodes. And I have signed on to write all of those episodes because actually there were facets to the characters that I didn't get to show in the book. There were characters who I really adored who had to sort of pull back on just because we had to keep the lens on Shuggie and Agnes. I find if for anyone who's read the book, I find Agnes's middle child Leek to be the most heroic character in the book. I also find her mother fascinating, Lizzie, and her husband, and so I wanted to sort of deepen their story and tell another facet to it. So when they asked me if I would do that, and Stephen Daldry asked me if I would do that, I jumped at the chance. I think it's a challenge, but I like a challenge.
Sí, pues yo tengo.
I'm looking forward, and all those of us who have read or will read the novel are looking forward to that experience of seeing it in a series. And as a final question, I think that your mother passed away before she could read the novel, I understand. And obviously this is related to your life, but you also claim the novel to be a machine for constructing, starting from your imagination. Would you say that your mother would have liked the novel, or did you even think about it while you were writing it?
I think my mother would have loved the book. I think part of the reason that my own mother felt or so overlooked was that she was overlooked, that people weren't listening to her story or seeing her pain. There was no concept of mental health issues. There was no concept of addiction coming from some kind of trauma. It was just something that somebody did, and the community wanted them to stop doing that. And so my mother would love to be memorialized in a novel like this. I think she would be incredibly proud. And, I think part of it is we rarely hear from Glaswegian housewives. That's just not someone you see often on the screen or often in literature. And one of the things that's been most powerful about the book, publishing it for me, is the response that's come from Glasgow and the people who say, I know Agnes, or I know Eugene, or I know a Shuggie. And also people who've also lived very similar lives. The book could have been great in Spain, but if people in Glasgow hadn't have felt the way they felt about it, I would have felt like I failed. And so it had to work for Shuggie and Agnes first.
I think this is one of the greatest achievements of your novel. Being such a local novel, it really appeals to universal things like the relationship of a mother and a son, whether it happens in Glasgow or in India. Douglas, it's been a real pleasure to be able to chat with you. Congratulations on your book. I think that you will have a very interesting experience yourself in the Feria del Libro, in the book fair in Madrid, and you'll be able to meet your readers here. So thank you very much.
Very much, and thank you for coming out. Thank you.